they also love their sport. They love what they do, and they want to protect that. And you can only protect that by having a sustainable
Yes, it's true.
amount of fish and sharks in the area. So they definitely care about the ocean. They definitely care about sharks. They definitely care about the ecosystem. They're just coming at it from a different vantage point.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I am your host, Byron Pace. This is episode 217 and a Modern Huntsman production. Now, I am joined this week by my good friend Sarah Roberts for a deep dive into a story that she wrote in Volume 9 Modern Huntsman, and you can read this story online right now by heading to modernhuntsman.com. So if you're fascinated by this conversation that we have now, head over there. I'll also stick the direct link to the story in the show notes, and you can go and read the story that she's talking about in this podcast. It was a story which was presented by Vista Outdoor, and it tackles the controversial topic of shark angling, both in the UK and in Florida, the potential restrictions around certain shark fisheries, and how scientists have worked with fishermen to collect vital data for their conservation. But before we dive into that, a quick shout out to this week's top tier Patreons, who include Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of RD Contracting, James Marchington, the guys at South Esher Stalking, Dick Ekstromer, and Mark Zabrowski. If you would like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace. And if you have any suggestions at all for the show, just email me info@paceproductionsuk.com, or you can find me on all the social platforms at Byron J. Pace. Sarah, welcome back to the Into the Wilderness podcast. The last time you and I chatted, I was sitting at your house and we did a podcast outside.
I know, and it was sunny and warm, and now it's wet and miserable.
It is wet and miserable, but the leaves are turning, and that is a really beautiful time of year, and the rivers are full, and the salmon are running and jumping. So this time of year brings happiness to my heart.
I was going to say, I see how you did that. You brought it all the way back round to fishing.
Easily done, especially since I've been doing a bit of fishing the last few weeks. Now we're going to be talking about something else aquatic. We're going to be talking about sharks on this episode, and particularly about the story that you wrote in Volume 9, Modern Huntsman. But before we get to that, I'm sure that people will recognize your name because you've been on the podcast, I think, possibly as many times as whoever else is the other person who's been on a number of times, because you're a fairly frequent guest on the podcast, which is awesome because I like hanging out with you and we always have great conversations. But give me the sort of the 2-second rundown about what it is that you do for people who maybe haven't heard the previous podcasts.
Yeah, I always struggle. You've always wanted 2 seconds, and I always struggle to define it. But essentially, I guess I communicate environmental issues and wildlife stories in various different forms. So I write kids' books, I do events, I also make content, and I'm an eco-journalist. Does that work? Is that enough?
That sounds great. That's very, very concise. And you've been doing a lot of stuff with your kids' books recently. Tell me a bit of an update on that, because that's a new one has come out since you and I talked last.
You know, there might even have been 2 new ones.
Is it really?
It might be. So we had, so I've got 3 out in the world now. So we've got Somebody Swallowed Stanley, Somebody Crunched Colin, and Somebody Woke Wilson, the Somebody series, as I like to call it.
Love it.
The latest one that came out, Wilson, I'm really sort of still holding his hand. He's quite new to the world. So he is a carbon atom, and it is explaining climate change and the concept of the carbon cycle to little people.
So a really complicated subject made consumable by small humans.
Yeah, literally. So yeah, Wilson is fast asleep in the Earth's crust, and then he gets woken up, sucked up through a big metal straw and spat out into the world. And then, just like Stanley gets chewed up and swallowed by lots of different creatures, he gets sucked into various things. He ends up obviously in an oil refinery, then in a car, and then, spoiler alert, in a cow, until there's lots of Wilson up in the air, bashing around with lots of other carbon atoms and causing havoc with the weather. And then, our savior child comes along and starts planting trees and helps him get back to bed to go to sleep. So it's kind of like the most basic version, I guess, which is quite nice for adults too, because I think sometimes we tend to overcomplicate and make things sound really, really intimidating. And actually, when you break these topics down, it feels a little bit more solvable.
Yeah, no, this is true. And I'm so curious about what the reception is like when you go into schools and read bits of the book to the kids. I almost want to like sit at the back of the room one day.
Yeah, I'll have to do a school up near you at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because like I think the way that I've designed these books, it's to teach them subliminally. So, I mean, they are at the end of it very, very familiar with the carbon cycle, and I like to think it's a bit of a Jedi mind trick. I've instilled all of the sort of notions behind climate change without them necessarily realizing that's what's happening. They're just thinking
Okay.
of poor old Wilson that's having a dodgy time. And then, of course, I've snuck the word fart in there into this one. So that always goes down a treat. But yeah, they do kind of get it. And I do explain at the end that it's actually based on a true story. And although you can't see it, Wilson and his friends are up in the air right now, banging around into each other. So what kind of things can we do to help? And then that's how we talk about, reducing the amount of carbon emissions by maybe cycling to school or walking to school or planting more trees or looking after nature. And yeah, it just feeds into the curriculum, hopefully, anyway, she says. But I mean, unfortunately, there really isn't enough environmental and sustainability related topics on the national curriculum right now. And I work closely with eco schools, so we're trying to put out a bit more support there for teachers that are wanting to incorporate that in. So hopefully Wilson's useful.
Oh, brilliant. Well, it looks like it's been very well received, and I've been following it on the socials as you've been touring around the country speaking to kids at different schools. So well done. Well done on getting another book out into the world.
I know. Well, the next one is a new series for older kids, which I think is way more exciting as well to you and I, because it's all about the world's wildest job. So
Oh,
yeah,
yes. I
that's
remember you
what I'm
telling me
working
about
on right
this.
now, and a podcast alongside it. And
That's
I'm
going to be amazing.
spending my entire days thinking I might want to change career paths.
That's the problem when you talk to awesome people on podcasts, as I well know. You're like, I want to do that. And
Yeah.
talking about fun things, just before we get into the main topic of this podcast, you are about to jump on a plane and go and see a very good friend of mine. Tell me
Yes.
what's about to happen in your world, because this is very exciting.
I
Back to a
know.
continent that I love the most.
I am off to Namibia. Yay. Yeah, I'm gonna go and hopefully showcase some stories, some environmental issues, and some poaching situations going on over there at Alex's place. Gutted you're not coming too. I
I
did try
know. If
and
it had
twist
just
your
been,
arm, but
if I hadn't also been getting on a plane like a day after you to the other side of the world, I would
excuses,
have, I
excuses.
would have come for sure. I don't need much of an excuse to go to Namibia or anywhere on the continent of Africa, to be fair.
Yeah, I haven't been. I mean, I haven't been to Africa since way before lockdown. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Very much so. And yeah, like you say, I'm going to struggle wanting to come back. But of course, I've got my dog. I have to come back now.
I
Oh.
always have to dry tears from my eyes when I'm sitting on the runway. It's terrible. I normally fix it by when they come down the aisle and they're handing out the drinks. I'm just like, that'll be 3 brandies, please. That'll fix my exit depression of the continent.
Oh, well, I'm not going to think about that side yet. I still
No,
got to
no,
get
you
out
haven't even
there.
arrived yet. You got so much fun ahead of you. That's
Yeah.
great. So back to I guess it was 6 months ago almost now, when we spoke about you doing a story for volume 9 of Modern Huntsman, and we bounced around a few ideas,
Mm.
and eventually we came up with the one that went into print. And I have to say, it's one of my favorite spreads. Like, between the images that we managed to find, some archival, some new ones that I shot with you, plus stuff that you'd taken through 2 different stories on 2 different parts of the world. The way that our designer pulled that together with a story that is very complicated and very deep, and quite easy to get lost in. I think the way that whole spread worked was brilliant.
Yeah, took some turns, didn't it, this
It
story?
did, yeah. So give us the kind of the initial rundown of what happened when you and I sat down and discussed like this, and you said to me, "This could be a really cool story. Can I run with it?" And I said, "That sounds awesome. Go, Sarah."
I think when we first sat down, I thought from the offset that it was going to be relatively simple. How wrong I was. Yeah, no, I had this idea. I had spent a bit of time, like you say, in another continent, which I'd spent some time out in Florida looking at the sort of crossover between shark fishing and shark science. And all the controversy surrounding catch and release, land based shark fishing of great hammerheads, which at that time when I went out, I think it was about 2017 when I went out and met Hannah from American Shark Conservancy and spent a fair amount of time sleeping out on the beach with these different fishermen to learn about their sport, but also, what that could potentially offer in terms of knowledge and data to the science world too. Um, so that was sort of like a really interesting story. I'd later accidentally stumbled across a parallel story in Cornwall in the UK, during which I'd ended up on a boat with some salty dog Cornish fishermen who were also catch and release shark fishing for all these species I never realised were in such abundance around the UK. I think quite a few of these ones, especially poor beagles and threshers, I sort of put in the brackets of myth and legend in the
Yeah.
UK
We don't
waters.
really think about sharks in UK waters.
Not really, not, I
And
mean,
poor beagles are related to great whites, aren't they?
yeah. Well, the thing is, I'd always sort of, we always use that quote, especially when I go into schools, there's over like 30, 40 different species of shark around the UK, but you say it and you're like, you're never going to see any of them. I did my dissertation on UK sharks, but it was cat sharks, or lesser spotted dogfish, whatever you want to call them, but like really sort of small, not particularly uh, intimidating sharks. And then I, jetted off all the way to the Bahamas to go and work at a shark lab because I just assumed that that was the next nearest place to get decent hands-on work with sharks, and enter into that field. Had I realised what was on our own doorstep. But to be honest, the science world, I think, is only really waking up to what we have now. And so when I went out, it was before lockdown. And it was these guys, these particular shark fishermen were mostly fishing for blue sharks, which I think since lockdown, people have become a lot more aware that we have this abundance of blue sharks traveling past our coast, especially because I guess with everyone holidaying in the UK, we now have a shark diving industry that's
It's kind of
kind of
crazy, isn't it?
growing. Yeah, it's mad.
Yeah.
It's mad. But yeah, people can go and snorkel and dive with blue sharks now off the UK, and that is,
They're
that's a
beautiful.
they're amazing, but this has all come off the back of fishermen who have shared their knowledge, and also sort of swiveled in terms of how they make their money. And the same exact thing happened in other places around the world, in Florida too, which is why they've got so much shark diving over there, is because of fishermen and fishing boats who sort of shared their knowledge, and that's how divers have found these different spots. Um, but yeah, what happened was I spent this time. I very nearly looked into opening a UK shark lab briefly, but then I had too many other things going on and intricacies in that world. I got a phone call after lockdown from the very same fishermen who were concerned because an application had been made to the JNCC, which was essentially an application to ban poor beagle catch and release shark fishing, which for them and for some individuals sort of signaled that it might be the start of the end for their sport, which was a big concern because of this mass amount of money, knowledge, data, everything that was within there, and that would be lost. So that's the story that you and I first sat down and discussed, right?
Yeah, yeah. So this idea that um, this what is a recreational activity, but linked, and a lot of people don't realize, and I guess we can dig into that, but linked to a lot of scientific research, was going to be completely shut down, but it wasn't very clear exactly why.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that intrigued me. It's like this idea of banning something because for reasons which are not necessarily scientific, but they're just morally objectionable by whoever it is that's put this motion forward, which seemed to be the case from the initial discussion that we had. It wasn't very clear why this had been put forward,
Mm.
and indeed what the implications would be.
Yeah.
Because I think it's so hard to know, like, and that we had this challenge when we when we were working on this story, is like what part of the story do you tell first to try and help people understand this? But I think maybe what will help create the groundwork for this is if we talk about, or you talk about, how the fishermen have worked with scientists and how that knowledge has helped gain this increased understanding in the last decade of sharks around the coast of the UK, because it seems like an unlikely alliance.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And the thing is, it's a parallel. It's such a parallel to the situation that was going on in Florida too. You seem to have this headbutt between shark fishermen, shark scientists, and then shark lovers. And everybody seems to think that they know best within that headbutt. And what's happened is people have tread on each other's toes. Communication barriers have come up, and forward momentum has not been quite so fast in certain places. And I think in the UK, in recent times, there has been, in different parts of the UK especially, quite a lot more collaboration happening between scientists and shark fishermen. And I think it's the shark fishermen that have sort of accepted, there is a big problem in terms of shark populations around the world. There's a lot of threats to our oceans. We love our sport. We love to fish. We do definitely, admittedly, get a thrill from this. But, we also want to conserve our sport and we want to conserve these species and we do respect these creatures. So rather than doing it for the fun of it, we'd like to also have a point to it, which is incredibly useful for science, incredibly useful for scientists, because as a scientist, you have very little opportunity to get out in the field. You have very little opportunity to actually spend time finding the different ecosystems, the different sharks, habitats. And I think being able to collaborate with people that have this huge wealth of knowledge, proven experience, proven catch rates, and not just that, they have anecdotal evidence for changes. It really, really speeds up the game in terms of science and actually finding out important data. But we sort of realized through doing this that it was more than just anecdotal evidence or a wealth of knowledge that they'd kept. A lot of these fishermen, and especially, I guess we're probably going to talk more about it, but especially the British Shark Angling Club, they've actually got written data and huge amounts of it from the catches that they've had, because they've recorded all of their information, which in itself is this amazing database of information that sets a baseline, I guess, of what these sharks are doing around the UK. And when you're taking into account things like climate change, overfishing, changes in terms of currents and predator and prey movements, it's amazing that you can have this comparison there. So, yeah, fishermen have this huge potential to really, really support the science world and in turn conservation. But of course, it's still quite tricky because the communication barriers are still up, shall we say, in some places and between some parties.
So tell me about actually being on the boat and the shark fishing in itself, because I don't know, I have this slightly funny feeling about shark fishing. I fish, and it comes down to this complexity of catch and release in my mind, because I understand why it's important, and I understand why it's important to keep like people on rivers fishing for salmon, because it's money and funds, and it helps us do the good work of conservation to try and safeguard Atlantic salmon. I've had this discussion on the podcast before, and if people weren't on the river, you wouldn't have the people who care partaking in it and caring about the river systems. But you are catching something just to like tug it around on the end of your line to go and put it back, because most rivers up here are catch and release for salmon. And I catch and release small trout are ones that I'm not going to eat all the time. But the idea of catching a big shark and putting it through all that stress and then releasing it feels strange to me, and I'm not sure how. I still don't quite know how I feel about it, but I've never done it. I've never stood on a boat. You have. So
Yeah.
tell me what that experience is like and what the discussions with the fishermen were like.
I mean, it is trophy hunting, isn't it, in a way? It's just taking a different turn in that what you
Because
used to.
what do they care about? I mean, are they doing it for measurements and rankings, or how does it work?
Yeah, I guess it is. You've got personal bests, they have like trophies they give out. Some people just come on just to catch that one shark to say they've done it. I think there's avid people that get the boat regularly, hire it out with their mates. You know, part of it also is they just really enjoy being out on the water.
I get that
Um,
totally. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's definitely a camaraderie that comes with catching a big predator. I mean, I'm sure you felt that when you've been out
Yeah.
in the field as well.
Yeah.
Um, I I guess I have caught quite a few sharks in my day. Maybe not as many as some, but it's quite normal for me, I suppose, because especially being out in somewhere like Bimini Shark Lab, most of our research to get any sort of research on a migratory species, you had to catch them, right? You had to tag them, you had to measure them, you had to take DNA isotopes. So we were catching and handling sharks literally on the daily, of all different sizes, from like your sort of 4 meter tiger sharks right down to your little, like, I don't know, 30 centimeter lemon sharks.
Yeah.
Um, and I even can, there's an adrenaline rush that you get, right? Because
Yeah.
you are fighting something that is strong and there takes a little bit of skill to get that into the boat efficiently. So, and you've got to have the right gear and you've got to know where to, there's a lot of weighting, you've got to know where to rig your bait and what bait to use and to chum. Everything's got to be quite concise in order to catch these big predators. They're not dopey, right? And I think for the fishermen, they probably just as much would enjoy catching a smaller species, like the mackerel or taupe, or maybe even going out salmon fishing. But for them, I think the excitement and the adrenaline that you get from catching a big predator is probably partly to do with the fact that they do fight more. It does take a bit more effort to get them in. There is a bit more risk involved if you have to handle something like that.
Mhm.
But also, I can't deny it. I'm pretty sure there's got to be something that you feel with your ego. If you're able to catch this big predator and outsmart it, But that said, like, that's not to take away from the fact that I think that they have their own love and respect for these creatures too. It's just the way they appreciate it is at the end of a line, up close after they've caught it, and the way a diver appreciates it is different again, like swimming past freely. So it's yeah, I don't think it's that dissimilar to the salmon situation. And I think what people automatically assume is because it's a bigger fish and it's fought harder that they're all going to die.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's not necessarily the case. Even from Hannah's study, I think that study in itself, nobody had really looked at the catch and release, great hammerhead, shark fishing from the beach before. Everyone
So
had a
this,
lot of
this was the
opinions about it. This is Florida. This is the
Study. Yeah.
comparative. Yeah. So everybody had a lot of opinions about it, especially like shark divers and, avid shark lovers, shall we say, all had their opinion, especially because there have been sharks that have washed up on the beach with hooks in the mouth. So undoubtedly there are accidents that happen. But when Hannah did her study, which was the first one really looking at that particular what would you call it? The quote. There's no quota that's set. There's nobody's ever done a sort of count of those sharks, shall we say? There's been no population census for those sharks that are passing off that shoreline to know if any quota is accurate. And she did her study by basically popping a tag on as the fishermen were doing their thing, measuring them, getting the photos. She ran in, stuck a sat tag on that pops off after 2 weeks. But all it does was tell you whether that shark survives or not. So if the shark was dormant after it's gone back in the water, the tag pops off and you know that there's been a mortality. So I think there was only 2 sharks, maybe even one or two in the whole 2 or 3 seasons that she was out there doing it that actually died. The rest of them actually did okay, and
that wouldn't be the perception, would it?
no, and
I
didn't even have that perception when I went out, because I was thinking, what was amazing in terms of the Cornish shark fishermen in comparison, like the Florida one, that was very extreme. Great hammerheads, we try to avoid catching them in Bimini. You would try and tag them while they were free swimming because they struggle on the line and because they have a higher mortality rate if you catch them on a long line or a deep line or anything like that. They can't buccal pump. They can't push water over their gills if they're not swimming. So
describe the fishing for them, because it seemed a bit wild. And in fact, I think I can probably say on the podcast that you're actually working on a series of short films that are going to add to both what you're hearing in this podcast, but also what was written in Volume 9 as well. Describe what that's like to be on the beachfront there with the fishermen.
Cold. Yeah, Florida is a lot colder than I imagine it would be in January. We're going to be sharing some of the footage that we took while we were out there. So I think one of the sharks that we caught, the time they actually, there was so much sleeping out on the beach and just shivering and just chatting away to these guys.
Sounds terrible.
Well, compared to the actual catch rate, I don't know what I expected, but it was a long time before they ever actually landed this particular shark species. They don't catch many at all for the amount of time they spend out there. We went out maybe for 7 nights before they caught one.
But were they picking up other species?
Yeah, you catch the odd bull shark, maybe a lemon or even a nurse, but for the most part, they're looking for great hammerheads, and they're there because you can see them on the drone, but they are really elusive. They're really hard to catch. And then they do put up, the reason they go for great hammerheads is because they fight so much, and that's why when we were at Shark Lab, you try not to catch them because the mortality rate is higher. And these are on long lines, so I was thinking, you're catching them, you're pulling them into shore, you have to lug them right up to where the water's lapping on the beach to be able to do, take the hook out and do your measurements and get the picture or get whatever they need. And then you put them back in. I was thinking, it's probably, even I was probably not going to be that great, but I'm not sure. But actually, yeah, the mortality rate was fairly low, all things considered. So that was quite a surprise. And then in comparison, you had Cornwall, and the boats that they were fishing with are actually, I would say, kitted up as well, if not better than some of the shark research boats that I've been on in the
Really?
past. Yeah, I mean, like they're fitted with a back door so you can get the shark in and out there. They try not to take the sharks on board unless they have to. They're very, very efficient, to be honest, at like grabbing them. It's such a, I think because it's a lot of the same people that get into this hobby and go out in groups again and again and again. And this was the same in Florida. They become quite an efficient team, And so I think maybe that's why they like the shark side of it. It's not the same as when you go out and you catch a salmon and maybe you're relying on one guy to help you net it, but it's, it's mostly
I
your
didn't
effort.
realize it was such a such
Well, you've got
a sort
like
of
three or
community
four of
activity.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, literally like trying to, grab hold of.
So you need
Get.
your mates to do it
You
with you.
can't do it on your own. You can't. And that's the same in the science world too. Like and the bond that you have with somebody when they're holding the back end of the shark or you're holding the front end. And if one of you lets go, obviously it's not going to be ideal. I think the risk side of it, you definitely form a much stronger bond with the people that you are with on that boat. Than anything else, because there is a real danger involved. So maybe it speaks towards the kind of primal instincts that we have from the days when you used to go out, and catch and hunt and get your food that way. The risk is probably half the attraction. Well, I know that's what got me into shark research in the first place. So, yeah.
So, of the guys that you were with, just to take it back to off the coast of England,
Mm.
and down by Cornwall and these places, we probably in a second need to go back and talk about how it was historically, because you found some amazing photographs at one of the museums that we were allowed to use and publish in the article. But what was the impression that you got from the guys that were on the boat about their relationship with the sharks? I mean, could you see that there was a care there? I mean, it seems hard to, particularly for people who don't fish or, this is a world that's totally new to them. The idea that there would be a care there seems very odd when they've just hauled it into the boat.
No, I think there definitely is. I mean, there's a spectrum on everything, right? And I'm sure there's probably the odd one or two that maybe don't care so much, but for the most part, yeah, there's kind of a revelry in this shark. Like they really like love them. It's a strange concept, but they definitely do, and they want to see them and they get excited about it. It's just a different way of interacting with an animal or a creature. It's not necessarily the best for the animal, but those interactions are very, very special and treasured by them. I mean, we had a call with Ian, who was one of the guys featured in the article, who has avidly collected every single mako shark capture. Like, he has collated records of every mako ever caught in the UK, and I think he manages to go way back when, almost like 100 years. And he told us a story of how one of the people that he found out about and he contacted was actually on his deathbed at the time. He had no idea he'd rung this guy, and he was trying to get hold of him just to get like first-hand account of what had happened, how big the shark had been, what were the conditions, like anything they could remember. And yeah, it was got in touch with their wife at the time, who said, it's not a good time this is happening. He was obviously horrendously apologetic, hung up, expected like that to be the end of that, felt a bit sad for the guy. Got a phone call the same evening from the guy himself, who'd perked right back up and was super excited to share that story and relive that encounter, because he'd carried it with him his entire life. And the thought
Amazing.
of it being useful to help protect sharks, because essentially all of this information that Ian's collated, he's given over for science studies. So I think that it's a different kind of relationship, but there's definitely an interest in the creatures, a respect for them, and a different kind of love. Because they also love their sport, they love what they do, and they want to protect that. And you can only protect that by having a sustainable
Yeah, this is true.
amount of fish and sharks in the area. So they definitely care about the ocean. They definitely care about sharks. They definitely care about the ecosystem. They're just coming at it from a different vantage point.
Our Mako, was it not a Mako that they used for the billboard for Jaws and not
Yeah,
a
the
great white? It
shark.
was.
Yeah, because they've got the
Because they got
crazy
prettier
gnarly
teeth.
teeth. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think you told me that.
No,
I'm
it
not
is.
claiming that
It
knowledge. I
is.
think you told me.
Yeah.
So, to go back to the controversy of this that was occurring in the UK, these fishermen that you were with had fished for porbeagles for decades.
Yeah.
Or maybe if they hadn't personally, but them and their predecessors had fished, and they had this amazing database of records, and they also worked with scientists to tag porbeagles. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think the tagging had happened quite recently. That was a new addition in the last sort of few years. I mean, the fishermen have been very, very wary about collaborating with anybody because they have been burned in the past. And that is, not to sort of pee anybody off, but
We don't mind.
there have been egos, I think, both sides of the fence, and scientists in the past have shat where they eat.
No, I
And
mean, not
they've
just in
come
the
in
shark
with
world. Yeah.
they've come in with their opinions of what they think is right and wrong and hypotheses, and and not listen necessarily to other vantage points, and that stops people wanting to work with them. And I
Yep.
think as we learn from different people we interviewed now, like there's been a lot of effort trying to repair those relationships and to build bridges and to be able to work with fishermen again, because they don't want to lose their sport. They don't have to work with anybody. What they're doing is totally legal. They don't have to answer to anyone, but I
Well, they don't
think
have to unless legislation gets
yeah,
passed.
absolutely. But I
Yeah.
think the reality is at the moment, you have got a lot of individuals amongst them that want to contribute. They want to help science. They want to learn more about their species because they do, like you say, they do kind of adore them in a different way.
What was the phone call that you got when this proposal for a change in legislation was being put forward to the Joint Nature Committee?
So I got a phone call from one of the guys on the UK Shark Angling Club committee, who obviously knew me because I'd been out with them. At the time when we went out with them, we filmed a bit with them, which is some of the footage that we're going to share, but we were keen to potentially collaborate, make a TV documentary. That's what we were filming for, and that's what a pitch that we were putting together, which unfortunately it didn't come off. It got shortlisted by Discovery, and then it just sort of like went into the abyss somewhere.
It
But they
happens
knew
in the TV
it
world,
does,
sadly.
doesn't it? But
Yeah.
these guys knew me, and they trusted me, and they had spoken in the past about worries of what would happen to their sport if conservationists or anybody that didn't necessarily like what they were doing were to put in something along the lines of this. And now it had happened. I think there was this big panic of like, oh, who's going to tell our side of the story? We don't really have a voice in this. Everyone's been a bit quiet and scared of how to use the voice for this because we don't want to stir the pot. We don't want to say the wrong thing. So I think they'd almost, they'd come to me hoping that I could write an article on this or just tell from my perspective, because they knew, I guess, that I'd worked with Hannah and my background in science, and I could understand the value that the potential value that their knowledge and their wealth of skills could be in the conservation world. So I was just sort of approached by them, can we put this can we do anything? Can you help us get our story out there? And so I came to you, first person
Yeah, and
naturally
then we
that I
started to
thought
put
of.
this together. So they were worried that this would be a species of shark. So this was specifically about porbeagles
Yeah,
that they would no longer be able to fish for. And I guess there would it be fair in saying that there was a concern that might then in the future be a cascade of
yeah.
which other species would be next that they weren't allowed to fish for.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, they have had incidents in the past where they've had sort of activists and conservation groups trying to stop them go out on the boats and trying to interfere in that side of it. So I think this has always been a little bit of a worry. It is a controversial sport, and it's crazy because obviously this sport was once absolutely celebrated. People from all around the UK used to travel in their masses to come and
I had
marvel at
no
them.
idea.
I,
Like when we pulled up the archival footage from the was it the Maritime Museum in
yeah,
Cornwall?
National Maritime Museum in
Yeah.
Plymouth.
They
Yeah,
were so sorry in Plymouth. They were so helpful. I'm so grateful to them for the imagery that they gave us. But I had no idea
no,
that
me
it was like
neither.
these massive contests, and they were eh, killing a lot because all the fishing that we've been talking about to this point has been catch and release for the
Yeah,
sharks. Back then, which is not even that far back, it's like the 60s. They were killing a lot of sharks.
yeah, yeah, thousands every year. And like you say, it was all for competition and bravado. But also a lack of knowledge. They didn't realize
That they were doing
like how
harm.
old these sharks were. They didn't realize the implications of taking out all these big predators. They didn't realize that these were like dwindling populations. And like I said, the same thing has been echoed all around the world. In every different country where there are sharks and fishermen, this same story has happened. But it's so crazy to think it's happened in the UK, and so subtly. It's been buried so well that we never
Most people
talk
didn't even
about it.
know.
We don't
No.
know. Yeah, like if you looked at one of these pictures now, I automatically look at it and think, oh, that's probably like North Carolina or Florida or
And one of the amazing things, and I say this because of that period of time, it was even less common then than it is now. Is some of what it seems to be that some of the most successful shark fishers were women.
Yeah, well, the largest, was it the largest mako or the largest
Yeah,
porbeagle? Yeah,
yeah.
that record was held by a lady. Yeah, um, which
It's
is
just not
it's
something you
crazy.
imagine in the 60s, like 50s and 60s, like many
Pat,
women going shark fishing.
no, Pat
Maybe I'm
Smith,
totally
wasn't
wrong,
it? I
but yeah,
think.
Pat Smith, and of
Yeah,
course now there's an entire database of information with her name.
yeah,
Uh,
I know, and it's quite ironic because obviously she was in the catch and kill era too, and now that database is suppose it's for conservation, isn't it? It's the opposite.
Yeah.
But I'm sure this is the thing is, and this is something Ian also said is, I think a lot of these people had they had the education, had they known at the time the implications of catch and kill, probably wouldn't have done it.
Probably not. No,
And this
no.
is, interestingly, I mean, for me, like I can look at it and just see parallels with how Bimini Shark Lab got set up. So obviously that has published so many papers that have all been really interesting for shark conservation and shark protection and learning about all different elements of shark ecology. But in the very first place, the origins of that lab, there's archive footage of Dr. Gruber and his day flying around in like a little seaplane in his helicopter, and just jumping out and harpooning them from the sky. Like I can't
Jeez.
even imagine how many sharks he killed before that lab was set up. But it was on pure ignorance. People just didn't know, like, some of these large shark species take decades before they get to an age where they can breed.
Mm.
And that's happened with science and fishermen sharing their knowledge together.
So, who actually put the sort of petition forward to stop the catch and release of porbeagles, and what was the premise of it? Why did they want to stop it? What had happened?
Well, I'm not sure if it's just the one party that did it, but I know we spoke to Shark Trust about this because they are had a part in it. And so this was the interesting thing. I think when we started following this story, we really didn't, we'd heard mostly one perspective, really. Although I have a science background, I hadn't really studied many sharks in the UK for any length of time whatsoever. So we were only really coming at it from the fisherman's perspective and then investigating it further. So when we spoke to Shark Trust, it was really interesting because we had kind of wondered if it had been an emotional knee-jerk reaction, but the reality is poor beagles are particularly vulnerable. It's not like the blue sharks, which have like they have lots and lots of young when they breed, and they breed fairly regularly, and they get to that breeding status quite early. The poor beagles are the exact opposite. They are closely related to great whites. They only have one or two young at a time, and then that happens far apart, and they can take decades before they get to the stage where they can breed, and there's a lot of threats on poor beagles. The particular reason they were keen to put a stop to it is because there seems to be a lot of evidence that there's a poor beagle breeding ground off the coast of the UK, in a particular area where the shark fishermen may or may not be aware of that. I think they probably are, based on their catches and what they get and the sizes of the different sharks that they catch. And because we don't have any information right now on the survivability of catch and release with that particular species in this country, I think they're erring on the side of caution.
Okay, so this is a precautionary principle. We don't have enough information, so let's not do it anymore. That was the
that
kind of
seems
premise.
to be the case. Yeah. The argument against that is we don't have any information. Surely this is the exact time where we need to get information, and maybe this is the exact moment and a perfect opportunity, if there is a breeding ground, to locate it and conserve it. So you've got two sides of the coin, really. And then and then the drama unfolds a little bit.
So where did the controversy start? Because what I can see, what I hope is becoming apparent is that rather than everybody getting in a room and working out how they can work collaboratively together, it's people shouting from opposite sides of a long corridor.
Yeah.
And as a result, everybody falls out, and then nobody wants to help one another. But really, everybody loves sharks, and everybody wants them to for the conservation of sharks to be successful, but can't necessarily agree about working together.
Absolutely. I think, it's very tricky. I think, well, what we saw when as you well know, so I started investigating this story. We'd arranged to go out on a boat and look at the actual technique involved in the catch and release of poor beagles, and like meet some of the people doing it. And all of the sudden, everything got very, very hushed up. And
a lot of people didn't want to talk to us for some reason.
Yeah,
I still don't really understand why.
You still don't. Yeah, I think it seemingly was mostly down to one or one or two individuals that felt that it's much better to sort of say nothing. It comes back, doesn't it, down to that old saying where it's you are the master of words unspoken, but the slave to the ones that you've said. And I think the fear of anybody possibly saying anything else that could pull the tiger's tail was so great that they would rather not talk at all anymore, which was so very strange, since I'd been approached to write this article, and everyone was like, we're all go, we want to tell our point of view, to like, oh no, we best not say anything at all, no, we can't comment, and it was like doors slamming shut left, right and center. It wasn't even just the shark fishermen that suddenly like panicked and backed off. There was even an element of like, a sort of collaborative group of shark scientists and shark fishermen that also panicked and shut the doors. And I think it's like, it's madness. It's absolute madness. For me, it's a time when everyone needs to be having the conversations more than ever. You know, what can you bring to the table? Well, what can you bring to the table? Why do we need to do this? Why shouldn't we do this? But this is, it's something that happens again and again and again and again, tiresomely in the conservation world, out of fear, and then also out of, I think, an element of egos involved here and
Probably,
there,
yeah.
and possessiveness over certain
Over knowledge and
areas
data,
and
because that was
knowledge
something
and
that
power
became
and
apparent, didn't it?
yes,
So where did it all end up at the end of the day? Because this petition had been filed, which was that the poor beagle fishery should be shut down. The fishermen have this amazing archive of data. They obviously don't want their fishery to be shut down because it's something that they enjoy doing, and there's an economic aspect of it as well. The scientists actually want the data that the fishermen have and the knowledge and the skills to be able to do the conservation stuff. But some of the people involved in that world also want to shut down the fishery. So where did that leave everything?
at the moment.
Have I summarized that
I think so.
accurately?
Yeah, and not necessarily people within the science world that want it shut down. People that just love sharks.
Yeah.
I think are can be even more passionate because they don't understand the need to tag or get data or any of that side of it. I think there can be more people that are even less amenable in that scenario.
Because it was something that did come out of your discussions with different people. Like Gonzo was one of them.
Yeah.
Amazing human being, great. Like I'm actually trying to get on a shark dive with him at some point.
Yes.
Along with some other people that you knew and have spoken to that were talking about the importance. These are scientists talking about the importance of maintaining relationships and collaborations with people who are out there all the time, who are not scientists, who are fishermen, and that there was great synergies to be had there.
Yeah, I mean, well, we looked around other areas of the British coast, and Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. There's interesting collaborations going on there. I think we spoke to Jenny, didn't we?
Yeah.
Who had literally, after I interviewed her, went out and they captured a big poor beagle, a female one,
A huge one.
a huge one, with the help of fishermen, and got some really interesting. That she was doing isotope studies and looking at the populations around the coast. I think there's evidence, so much evidence, and so much proof that these relationships not only are vital, but can be really, really fruitful too for the better understanding of how to conserve these species. In terms of Cornwall, it's still in limbo. As far as I know, it's still very tight-lipped. It's still very quiet. Everyone's sort of cautiously not saying anything or doing anything. Because the UK's had so much bother in terms of who's going to run the country.
We've had a bit of turmoil the last few months,
Yeah,
haven't we?
I think that slowed down movement through Parliament. But I mean, for me, the overall thing, the biggest takeaway was that Cornwall was the first county in the in Europe that became like the place for big game fishing. It was the
Yeah, it was
first
like a
big game
mecca.
fishery in Europe. It was
Yeah.
the mecca, and Cornwall really led shark fishing. And this was at a time when that then ricocheted around the rest of the world. And I think to realize just how many sharks have been landed in Cornwall over those decades, and how much fishing has been done, and how much knowledge has been gathered, it's an absolute travesty that we are not so much further ahead, that in that particular county, and Devon, too. Like, why are we not pioneering shark research in the whole of the UK coast? Why are we so far behind? But I think, unfortunately, trust is such a key issue, and it's been damaged to the point where people just don't even trust each other within their own communities as well to move things forward, and it's hindering everything. for sharks, for fishermen, for scientists, for the entire um, transfer of knowledge.
It's a story that I'm sure is replicated in many species in many different parts of the world. And I'm just in the process of wrapping up a story for the next volume of Modern Huntsman on commercial whaling,
Mm.
specifically off the coast of Norway. And there's some similar parallels there with, lack of trust and communication. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if people aren't prepared to talk to one another, you'll never find positive avenues to move forward. And that's what happened in, what seems to have happened in this case with a very vulnerable species, where there could be really incredible positive outcomes if the expertise of all of the different people came together.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we're in a situation where there is this protectiveness over data, so people don't want to share it. Protectiveness over just knowledge that is being gained and passed on through generations, and to your point, an unfortunate lack of trust that the information that they give to scientists or conservation groups, that I'm talking about the fishermen, might be then used to
Against them.
shut down the
Yeah.
very thing that is the most important thing to them, that enabled them to get the data in the first place.
Yeah.
And I don't think that any one of them, and you've already said this, would do anything that would mean that they saw the last of the particular species of shark that they like to fish for. They want to see more of them because they want to keep on doing what they're doing. And if they could um, work collaboratively in a way that was going to proliferate the species, I can't see from the conversations and interviews that you did and putting together that story that that is not exactly what the shark fisherman would do.
Yeah, I think it's the same across the board. But of course, it's also the trust that if that means they have to stop fishing for a certain period of time to then be enabled to fish again or
Yeah.
fish less or in different areas, there's got to be that trust on all sides that they are then going to be allowed to when the population comes back.
And
Um,
that's the challenge because that
yeah,
that story has happened a number of times with a number of species around the world where there's been a realization and acceptance, often due to mismanagement, that we have to stop harvesting or culling or hunting or whatever the metric was used or, for that species for a time so that they can do it again, and it never opens up. And
yeah.
in some instances, it hasn't opened up, not because there isn't a harvestable surplus anymore. It's just because um, the public feeling on it has changed since when it was stopped. So
So
I can
interesting.
understand that
Yeah.
risk. I can understand the feeling of that risk for sure.
I understand it, but then I also just very recently made a little teeny tiny mini reel documentaries for Instagram during a time in Mallorca, looking at marine protected areas. And one
Yeah.
thing that came out of that is just how vital fishermen are for marine protected areas. You know, we all love the idea of having this absolute Eden where nothing gets caught and nothing, and it flourishes naturally. But who on earth is policing that? Who are the eyes on it? Because scientists have such a limited amount of time they can spend out on the ocean. It's maybe like a few field days a week in comparison to fishermen who can be out there every single day. So I think in a way we're kind of cutting our nose off to spite our face if you were to stop fishermen, especially catch and release fishermen, from ever continuing, because they are the ones that are going to see if there is anything wrong, and they're the most likely to want to report, whether it's maybe we need to go down a more permitted system or something else. But these guys can be the absolute stewards that are needed and necessary at a time like this when our oceans, are facing bigger threats than just necessarily catch and release fishing. So yeah, it's a bit of a
Find people who
travesty.
want to protect the oceans and the species and the environment, and even if you take a different thing from it, find a way to work together. I think that's the takeaway.
Absolutely.
Which
You don't all have to
Which you agree
necessarily
with.
be invested in it for the same reasons, but you are invested in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thanks so much for taking the time to go over your story. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you. It was it's actually my favorite sort of. I mean, you did almost all of the heavy lifting, but you were bouncing ideas off me the whole time, and I really enjoyed the process of being that sounding board while you were putting the piece together. And I'm really
I
looking
mean, I
forward
needed
to
your
being able.
handhold on this one.
It was
I
complicated,
definitely needed your handhold.
and particularly when everything shut down and no one would speak to you anymore.
Yeah. I thought
Yeah.
the story was over, but actually our story was just beginning at that point.
Yeah. But I can't wait to show everybody the short films off the back of this, which will be coming out in the months after this podcast goes out. And I wish you the best of luck over in Namibia. I'm very jealous that I'm not getting on a plane with you. And I'll catch up with you when you get home.
Thank you very much for having me once again. It's been a pleasure.